Okay, I had my Scout Rogue test ride yesterday, and so today I thought I'd put down my thoughts and make this video. Now, I wasn't planning to test ride the Scout Rogue. I actually called into Indian Motorcycle in Ballarat to talk about my Indian Chief order and see how that was coming along, and also to perhaps start thinking about a backup plan in case the Chief keeps getting delayed. And I was thinking I really do like the Scout Bobber 20, and I thought I might just suss out what the availability is on that particular bike, and especially the red one. The red one's the one I really like. And while I was in there, I was sitting on the Chief Bobber Dark Horse just to see what that riding position's like compared to the Chief Dark Horse. And also I was sitting on the Scout Rogue, and I thought this is pretty comfortable. And that's when Mark offered me a test ride just to see if it, if it's something I might like. So I took the Scout Rogue for a test ride, and here are my thoughts. Now, I'll also be comparing the Scout Rogue to the Scout Bobber 20 because I have experience test riding that bike, and I'm also going to compare it to the Indian Chief Dark Horse, in particular in relation to pricing. The Dark Horse does come into the equation once you start putting a few accessories on the Scout to sort of improve its baseline performance, if you like, but I'll go into that more a little bit later. Now, the first one I want to talk about is ride quality. When I rode the Scout Bobber 20, I was quite happy with the ride quality, except for a couple of bumps here and there that were a bit spine jarring, and this is because the Scout standard has about 2 inches of rear travel on the rear suspension, and it can get a bit hard on certain bumps, but for the most time I found the Scout Bobber 20 to be quite alright. Now, the Scout Rogue, on the other hand, I did feel the road a lot more on that bike. Obviously, the fact that could be suspension settings. The suspension might have been set up a bit softer on that particular bike. But the other thing that could be making a difference is the tyres. Now, on the Scout Bobber 20, you have a smaller front rim and a higher profile tyre on the front. On the Scout Rogue, you have a larger front rim, I think it's 19 inches, and a lower profile tyre. So what that means is the outside diameter of both wheels is going to be pretty similar, but the ride quality, I would expect, and I do feel this is the case, is better on the Scout Bobber 20 and the Bobber or the spoked wheel models because of that extra height in the tyre wall. It's going to soak up the bumps better than what a lower profile tyre is going to do. And I did feel that, I reckon, on my test ride. Now, the workaround is to buy the accessory Fox shocks for the bike, and there are now a new set of shocks that are available for the Scout which has a piggyback reservoir, and I understand that could be longer in suspension travel, which would jack the bike up at the back a little bit with the piggyback shocks. I think the Fox shocks are the same as the standard shocks in travel, but from all reports the Fox shocks really do improve the ride quality of the Scout and are worth putting on. Downside is they're $2,500 Australian. And you can see here now when I'm talking about when you put some accessories on the baseline Scout, how it starts to push it up closer to the Chief range of bikes. The next thing I want to talk about is seat comfort. Now, on the Scout Bobber 20, I test rode, it had the 1920 seat, which is like that tractor style solo seat, and I found that very comfortable. The seat on the Scout Rogue is obviously softer when you first sit on it, and it does feel instantly comfortable, but I did find it sort of got like a bit of a curve to it, and it did sort of start to roll my back in under a little bit as I was riding, and I didn't like that seat as much. And I did find the riding position on the Scout Bobber 20 with that 1920 seat to be superior for someone my height, 6'1". So if I bought a Scout Rogue, I'd be putting that seat on that bike, but in combination with the Fox shocks. I think that'd be the two key accessories I would put on that bike. And so for comfort, I still feel the Scout Bobber 20 with its higher profile tyres is going to be a more comfortable bike long term than the Scout Rogue. Which now brings me on to the screen, because that's one of the features of the Scout Rogue that I really like, that cowling and the screen. And I was curious to see how effective that was for someone my height, because I have seen online people shorter than me have said it's been very good for keeping wind off them and things like that. But I think you'd have to be a lot shorter than me, I'm 6'1" again, for that screen to be effective, because I found it was hitting me, the wind was hitting me probably from here up, which means my arms were in the wind, and it was coming down probably to about here. So I was pretty open into the wind with that Scout Rogue fairing and screen. Obviously it's going to keep wind off my core and keep the pressure off my core, but it's not something I think, yeah, that's a big selling point for me, because I think it made a little bit of difference, but not a lot of difference. And what I would prefer to do is buy the larger screen, and I'll show an image of it here if I can, for the Scout Bobber 20, and I think that would be a better option for someone my height. I still would have my head probably clear in the wind, but it would keep most of the wind off my torso, I feel. I haven't tested it, but that's what I think. Now, the handlebar position is the same as the Scout Bobber 20, which I found very comfortable, very natural. But after riding the Chief Dark Horse with its lower bars, yeah, I did find that riding position more comfortable, surprisingly, than the more sit-up and beg riding position of the Scout Rogue, the Scout Bobber 20, and the Chief Dark Horse. Sitting on the Chief Dark Horse on the showroom floor with its mini apes and forward controls, yeah, I'm still more comfortable in the Chief Dark Horse with its lower bars and mid pegs, although I think on the Chief Dark Horse I would be comfortable with the forward controls as well. But and I might try and experiment with that when I eventually get my Chief. The peg position on the Scout Rogue is the same as the Scout Bobber 20, which is more forward, and I found that really comfortable. I had a nice bend in my leg, so that was really good. And that's the interesting thing about the Scout range, is it's a smaller feeling bike, but I still find it comfortable for someone my size, 6'1". So if you are tall, I don't discount it. It's definitely worth a look. The pegs, again, for corner clearance, I didn't scrape once. Once you've owned the bike for a while and you start getting more adventurous, obviously they will touch down. For the riding I've been doing, I'm yet to scrape the pegs, so I'm quite happy with the peg position. The pegs are nice and wide, so there's a lot of room for your foot to move around on. I find them very comfortable in the Scout. Now let's talk about engine character and performance. Well, anyone that's been watching my channel for any time knows that I'm a big fan of Indian engines, and again, the Scout doesn't disappoint. Beautiful, strong pulling force right from down low. It's not the same as the 116 in torque, but it's still got plenty and still satisfying. And then once you start opening it up and get into the rev range, it just builds and builds and builds. And to the point where I have seen people mention that in roll-ons and even like drags, the Scout does best the 116 in standard form because of its horsepower and power to weight ratio. So if you're looking for a more performance cruiser, I'd probably say look at the Scout over the 116, the Chief 116. The Chief 116 is more about torque and grunt and puts a smile on your face that way, whereas the Scout range is more about horsepower. So if you're looking for more of a performance cruiser, I'd say lean towards the Scout. But if you're looking for something that's just got a lot of roll-on grunt and you just like to short shift and power on that way, look at the Chief range. Clutch feel. Interestingly, I found the Scout to have a heavier clutch pull than the Chief, which surprised me. I didn't notice it the first time I rode the Scout Bobber 20, but after riding the Chief, yeah, it is a little bit, it's not bad, it's just a little bit heavier in pull than the Chief, which is quite interesting. Gear shifting I found to be quite good, no problems at all. It's not a slick shifting gearbox, but it does require a solid pull, but that's what I expect from this type of bike. So yeah, that is completely fine and what I was expecting. Now the brakes, interestingly, I did feel the brakes did feel a little bit wooden on the front to pull. They certainly work fine and pull you up no problems at all. But in comparison to the Chief, I didn't feel that on the Chief. So that was really interesting. Still wouldn't put me off buying the bike at all. It's just that I did notice that little bit of difference between the Scout and the Chief. Now, handling. This is the one that really surprised me because I was quite happy with and quite pleased with the Scout handling. But after riding the Chief Dark Horse, I reckon the Chief handles better. Even though it's a bigger bike, yeah, I prefer the handling of the Chief, which is quite interesting. The Scout turns in fine, handles fine, it's not a problem at all, but the Chief does it noticeably easier, which is quite a statement. Now the overall size of the bike, again, as I was saying, between the Chief and the Scout, the Chief is noticeably larger, not in a bad way, it is noticeably larger. So if you're looking for a smaller bike, I think the Scout is less intimidating when you first sit on it compared to the Chief, especially if you haven't sat on either of these bikes. When you hop on the Scout and go back to the Chief and back to the Scout, you sort of think, yeah, the Chief is a bigger bike and it does feel heavier. The Scout doesn't feel like a lightweight, but it is but it is noticeably smaller to sit on. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit less intimidating, the Scout might be a better option in that situation. Now we look at pricing for the bikes, and this is where I want to compare the Chief Dark Horse, because the Scout Rogue starts at 24,495 Australian. The Scout Bobber 20 is 23,995 Australian. The Scout Bobber is 23,495 Australian, and that's the one with the lower bars. And the Indian Chief Dark Horse is 28,995 Australian. If we round that out, the Scout Rogue is 24.5, and the Indian Chief Dark Horse is 29. When you add some accessories that I'd like to add to these bikes, in the case of the Scout Rogue, I'd still want to put on that 1920 seat. Don't know how much that is, but I imagine around the $300-400 mark Australian. And I'd want to put the Fox shocks on, and that's $2,500 Australian. So you can say there's around about 3,000 in extras there. And the other thing I would want to do is put on the LED headlight, and I imagine around $500 perhaps there. So that's $3,500 on top of the Scout Rogue, which brings it up to $28,000. Now the Chief Dark Horse is $29,000. So you can see why I'm bringing the Indian Chief Dark Horse into the equation, because you're getting a better riding bike suspension-wise out of the box than the Scout, and you wouldn't need to change the suspension. I found it completely fine on the Chief Dark Horse, and actually nice. The seat comfort was great stock from the Chief Dark Horse, so I wouldn't need to change the seat for me. With the Chief Dark Horse, you get that ride command system, which has the GPS built in, and you're getting what I believe is a better handling bike than the Scout, all for $1,000 extra. And I can see why someone who might go in to buy a Scout would end up riding out on a Chief, especially when you compare the price difference. Which then leads me to the question, does the Scout need updating? It's been around for quite a while in its current form, and now that we have the Chief, and especially when you compare the pricing and the features you get on a Chief versus the Scout, I really do believe it's time to update the Scout and start to bring in some of the goodness that the Chief has back into the Scout range, because I still love the Scout range. If I could have two bikes, I think I probably would have a Scout and a Chief in the garage, or if I could have a few bikes. I actually don't mind the simplicity of the Scout. I don't mind that it doesn't have the modes. I don't mind it doesn't have GPS. I quite like looking down and just seeing that one round gauge with the speedo on it. It has gear position, it has odometer, it has the basics on there, everything that I would need. So yeah, I don't mind that at all actually, but it's only in terms of pricing, and when you see what you get for your money on the Chief, then you start to think, well, I'm thinking that the Scout does need an upgrade. It's due for an upgrade. So for my final thoughts, however many months it takes to get one, I'll definitely be waiting patiently for my Chief. But after riding the Scout Rogue and sitting on the Bobber actually with its mini apes and its more sit-up and beg riding position, comparing it to the Chief Dark Horse with its lower bars and a bit more reaching to the bars, I now want to test ride the Scout Bobber. Originally, as I was thinking with the Chief Dark Horse, I thought that riding position wouldn't suit me at all, but it actually worked for me on the Chief Dark Horse. So now I want to try the Scout Bobber, so I'm going to see if I can do that. Alright, well that about covers it for this video. I hope I've covered everything. If you think of something that you'd like to know about, let me know in the comments below and I'll certainly answer your comments. But yeah, that about does it. So again, thank you to Indian Motorcycle in Ballarat and Mark there for letting me test ride the Scout Rogue. And if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, bye for now.